everyone, this is Central and welcome to part 3 of my Bofuri Maple cosplay. In this video, I'll be covering the foot armor, the hairpin, the gloves, the armor attachments, and the painting. To begin on the foot armor, I made a form-fitting template using the saran wrap and masking tape method before marking my pattern out and then cutting myself free. But before I can transfer the pattern onto paper, I made a few extra markings so the final pattern can lay flat and I didn't have to make any more pieces than necessary. Once my tape and saran wrap patterns were flat, I folded them in half and traced them onto a folded sheet of paper, cutting off the excess and then unfolding them to get the entire paper pattern. Since I wanted my feet to have full movement, I used a 4-way stretch leather faux fabric that I folded in half with the wrong sides facing out and pinned the pattern down before marking them out with my silver Sharpie, removing the paper templates, and repinning the fabric together. With the fabric pieces ready to go, I used my scissors to cut along the silver guidelines while setting aside the extra fabric that wasn't going to be used for this part of the project. After the fabric was cut out, I removed the pins that kept the two layers of fabric together before folding one of the patterns onto itself with the right sides facing inward and then pinning along the edges before taking it to my sewing machine and stitching the two sides together. To get the complete foot shape that I needed, I pinned the remaining edges of the fabric together with the wrong sides facing outward before sewing them together to get the final shape. I also did the same steps for the ankle segments of the covering and the Velcro attachments that were going to keep this piece of the costume together. For the armor piece that is going to go on top of the fabric, I saran wrapped and mask taped my foot before marking the shape out, slipping the pattern off my foot, removing the excess saran wrap off with my scissors, and transferring the tape pattern onto paper. Once the template was cut out, I used leftover 4mm EVA foam that I have saved from the earlier part of my cosplay and marked the pattern out before cutting it out with my box cutter and beveling all the edges with my Dremel. The final steps that I did for the foot armor were priming the pieces with 2 layers of plasti dip, painting 2 layers of metallic black paint onto the pieces with a few gunmetal detailing around the edges and hot gluing them onto my fabric. Note, when using this sort of particular fabric, I highly recommend putting a few layers of paint onto it so the foam and fabric can stick together. On to the next part! The hairpin is probably the simplest part of this project and also the part that I didn't record much of, so I'll make this quick. Using makeshift paper templates, I cut out a small circle and 4 long diamonds from 4mm EVA foam with my box cutter, beveled all the edges with my Dremel tool, and glued the pieces together into its compass-like shape with rubber cement. Then with Golden's iridescent pearl fine paint, I coated the hairpin 3 times and finished it off by attaching a regular hair clip onto the back side of it. If you exclude the time it took for the paint to dry, this took me about 10 minutes to make. To make the gloves, I used a paper template of my hand before placing it onto a 4-way stretch faux leather fabric that was folded with the right sides facing each other and marking around the paper pattern with a white pencil. After removing the template, I pinned the fabric layers together before cutting them out with a pair of scissors and removing the excess fabric off to the side. Fun fact about this part of the costume, I did actually make the gloves prior to almost everything else, but with the fabrics I used, they weren't comfortable and the length was off, so I had to remake them. Well, let's get back to the project. Using a 4-way red stretch fabric that I folded over itself 2 times, I used a paper template as a guide and pinned around it, making sure to add a few inches onto the top and bottom portions of the sleeves before cutting it out. I thought that I was going to be able to use my white pair of scissors to cut out the fabric, but since the blades were dull, I had to switch back to my orange pair. With all my pieces cut out, I faced the right sides of the red and black stretch fabrics together and pinned along the edge before running a straight stitch across it with my sewing machine. After the pins were removed, I folded the open glove with the right sides facing together, pinning around the perimeter of it and then sewing the entire thing together. Making sure that the glove fit me comfortably and the length was appropriate, I turned the glove inside out and pinned a diagonal line across the top before cutting the excess material off and folding the raw sides of the fabric over. The last thing that I did before hemming the gloves was adding a band of silicone elastic around the top and stitching it down. I used the same band for my stockings to prevent them from falling down on my legs, and I'll admit that I succeeded on keeping my gloves from falling down my arms. Speaking of keeping things from sliding down my arms, let's get the attachments for this armor done. Using my arm and leg templates that I have as a guide, I made 2 paper templates that would cover the lower portion of my legs and arm before laying the pattern on top of a 4-way stretch fabric, carefully pinning them both through the paper and the fabric to ensure that the pieces are flat, and cut along the paper template until all the pieces were made. Once I had my 4 pieces, I measured out how much Velcro I needed for each segment and snipped off the excess that I did not need before pinning them to the edge of the fabric, making sure to have one attached to the right side of the fabric and one attached to the wrong side of the fabric before stitching them down on the sewing machine. I can't remember if I showed this in part 2 of my cosplay videos, but for the breastplate and waist armor, I did a similar thing of measuring out how long of a Velcro piece that I needed and directly hot glued it onto the EVA foam. But back to the arm and leg attachments, I realized that my original intention of having them go fully around my limbs was not going to work, so I closed the Velcro onto itself and cut the fabric tube into 2 pieces. With my attachments ready to go, I applied a thin layer of hot glue on the edges of my armor and carefully applied the fabric onto it. Please be careful while using a hot glue gun, you do not want to have burnt fingertips. And with that dangerous feat out of the way, let's get to the final part of this video. Before I can use any of my fancy acrylic paints, I started off by priming my armor with 3 layers of black Plasti-Dip. Make sure to do this in a well-ventilated area, otherwise the fumes will instantaneously get to you and the smell will stink up the whole house. Trust me, I did this once in the garage, and while I had the space, it was not ventilated, and I learned my lesson very quickly. After I finished priming all of the armor pieces, I used Folk Arts metallic paint in sequin black and gave each armor piece 2 sturdy coats of it, ensuring that the first layer was completely dry before applying a second. I made sure that with each coat of paint that I applied, I got into every nook and crack. It can look a little odd having that one small spot of armor look different from the rest, and then you have to take more time covering that little segment. Since this armor had multiple layers on top of one another and I wanted them to be seen, I used a combination of Folk Arts metallic paints in sequin black and silver anniversary to get a gunmetal color that I dried brush along all of the edges, giving the armor a weathered look. Weathering in simple terms is when you give your outfit an effect that makes it look like it's been used, and even though Maple is supposed to be this near indestructible character with an impossibly high vitality rate, she probably has gone through quite a few battles to get to where she is today, and I wanted to give the armor a slightly more realistic touch. Speaking of touches, I used a combination of Americana's acrylic paint in the shade of Alizarin Crimson and Apple Barrel's Outdoor Indoor Gloss acrylic paint in the shade of Real Red to create the right shade of red for the accent pieces, making sure that each coat was dry before applying another layer. It was a trial and error to figure out the ratios for these colors, but eventually I got the right color and used that as a reference for the remainder of the outfit. And speaking of outfits... And this is how Maple turned out. Overall, I'm extremely happy with the results considering that I've never done a project of this scale before. And because the outfit was made of EVA foam and mostly performance fabrics, it was extremely lightweight and comfortable. My only nitpick that I have with this outfit is that I don't have 100% movement, but I have enough to enjoy the cosplay. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you would like more content like this, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in part 4. Ciao!